Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Vote for Change Town Hall hosted by Sac Change Coalition. My name is Ashley Draper, organizer and co-founder of Sac Change, and I'm so excited to get into this panel discussion with you about Prop 17. You may have received your voter guides in the mail, and in a moment we're going to show you a quick 90-second video giving you just enough time to go and grab it. Before we get started, let's go over some house rules. We're streaming this live video via Facebook, and we do want your questions, we want your feedback, we want the discussion. We only ask that you are respectful to us and to each other. So please, no foul or disparaging language in the comments. Let's keep it clean. Also, if you find this discussion helpful in making your decision, join us again next week. October 1st, we're discussing Prop 20, and on October 8th, we are discussing Prop 25. The next voice you'll hear following this video is our esteemed moderator, Mr. Khaim Moton. With more than 18 years in politics and experience in public policy consulting, we are very lucky to have him. So without further ado, grab your voter guides, and we'll see you after the video.
Election officials work hard to maintain the integrity, security, and privacy of elections in Sacramento County. Every registered voter in the county will receive a vote-by-mail ballot in the mail. Have you ever wondered what happens to your ballot when you send it in? Returned ballots are received at the elections office where they're processed and counted. Each voter's ballot envelope has a unique barcode that gives you credit for voting. This ensures that each voter can only vote once. Every signed ballot envelope is compared to signatures on file for the voter in our database. If your signature matches, your ballot moves on to the next step. If your signature is challenged, you'll be notified and given instructions on how to correct the issue. The two most common reasons a ballot envelope is challenged are the envelope isn't signed or the signature doesn't match the voter's record. A challenged ballot will be counted once the problem is corrected. You can check the status of your ballot at www.elections.saccounty.net. When voter signatures are verified, ballot envelopes are opened and the ballot is removed, unfolded, and prepared for processing through scanners, which total up the votes. Results are tabulated and released after the polls close on election night. When you vote by mail, you can be assured that your vote counts and that your ballot is both secure and private. If you have any questions, contact the Sacramento County Elections Office or visit us online.
Good evening and welcome. As Ashley said in the introduction, I'm Khaim Moton, and thank you for joining us in this panel discussion brought to you by the Sac Change Coalition. And tonight, as in this town hall, we're going to discuss Prop 17. So before we get into that, though, it's quick questions like, for those of you wondering, what is a proposition? Well, basically, it's two things. One, it is the direct form of democracy whereby you can go around the state legislature and you can put new laws into effect in the within the state of California. Or in some cases, it's where if the legislature or citizens want to actually change the state constitution, they have to pass a law and then it has to go before voters for a ballot. So an example of that, and something that leads into what we're going to be talking about in terms of Prop 17, was a proposition that was passed in 1994. And this was Proposition 36. It's better known to us all as the Three Strikes Law. This was a proposition that went into effect and said that no matter what kind of crime you committed, could be stealing a piece of paper, it could be stealing a pack of gum, if this was your third offense, you would go to jail for 25 years or more, just regardless. So as we have now gone through 20 plus years of over-criminalization, mass incarceration, now we're starting to see a change in the way that our society wants our government to act. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and start discussing Prop 17. And first, though, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists for the evening. First, I'd love to welcome Dr. Flojaune Cofer. Flo? And,
hi, everyone.
And also Shay, Franco, Clausen. And Flo, if you could give us a few minutes on who you are and why this is important for you to be here tonight.
Sure. Thank you so much, Khaim, for the warm introduction, and to Sac Change for hosting this event tonight. As Khaim mentioned, my name is Cofer, Flojaune, and I am a resident of Sacramento. I have lived here for 10 years. It is my adopted home. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I claim both of the cities with rivers very, very strongly and very enthusiastically. I am an epidemiologist by training, and I serve as the Senior Director of Policy for an organization called Public Health Advocates. And I think the thing that, is probably most important to know about me is that public health isn't just my job, it's who I am, it's how I see the world. And I really view most issues through a public health lens. And so that's part of the way that I've come to social justice work, and in particular, criminal justice work. I also serve now as the chair of the Sacramento Measure U Community Advisory Committee, and we are overseeing the funds that come into the city for the Measure U sales and use tax. So that's kind of what I do in Sacramento. I love it here, and I'm really grateful to be able to be on this panel and walk us through our ballot today.
Thank you. And Shay?
Shay Franco Clausen, and I am from San Jose native, and that's where I currently live right now. And I'm here tonight as campaign manager of Yes on Prop 17, that will restore the voting rights of over 50,000 Californians that are reintegrating into our community. Outside that role, I'm actually formerly incarcerated myself, and I am an elected official that serves here in Santa Clara County. I serve as on the Black Caucus with the CDP as an elected delegate for the Santa Clara County Democratic Central Committee, as well as on the chair of the Commission on the Status of Women and Human Trafficking. So I come to this work from lived experience, but also supporting many of the Black and Brown communities that have been underrepresented, disenfranchised since the inception of this country. And right now, I'm very proud of all the work that is happening, all the advocates, all the brave and courageous legislators, and people that come to it from a health lens to see that is actually the intersectionality. So I'm honored to be here tonight to talk about what's on your ballot.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. So as we dive in and we start talking about this, first of all, it's a presidential election year of critical importance. Important, but the importance of what we need to vote on doesn't just stop there, or at the Senate, or at the House of Representatives. You've got to go all the way down the ballot, which brings us to the California state ballot and the measures that are on there. So we've got Proposition 17. Now, if we read from the Legislative Analyst's Office description of this from the state of California, this constitutional amendment would amend the state constitution to restore the voting rights to persons who are now on parole. They have served their time in jail, and now they're on parole. So what I want to kind of get to, and the first question I want to ask from that is start with you, Shay, as a campaign manager. How did this come about? Because I've seen various kind of starts and fits of efforts of criminal justice reform, but how did this particular measure get to be on the ballot?
So this actually was authored by Assembly Member Kevin McCarthy, courageous leader, and it was ACA 6 that was brought together by a coalition of organizations. Once it was passed through the state Senate and Assembly with two-thirds nonpartisan support, that was how it was able to get on the ballot. I joined this because when they were looking for a campaign manager, I work on political campaigns because I believe that we make systemic change by changing the people who make the decisions. And so I was someone with lived experience and currently advocating for my family that are in jail, that have been shot by the police. They thought I was a good fit. And now that the proposition is on the ballot, people are going to start voting on it between October 5th and November 3rd. I feel we're in a really good position as the nation faces its ugly truth about Jim Crow laws that plague California. And we're the last of 3 states behind. Time to make change and give those people that are out on parole the right to vote, because parole is not a punishment.
So to that, to a slightly different point on that, Flo, if we pass this, we would join at least 16 other states. Because as I look, they're kind of all over the map, particularly if you go, not just some states in the deep South, but in other places too. If you're a felon, it's just kind of a wrap for you. But in passing this and restoring the rights to formerly incarcerated and those on parole, although we have the text of what the language says, and speaking to you specifically from a public health standpoint, what does this actually mean?
Well, for one, I mean, we know voting rights are incredibly important. One of my friends often says, you know something's important when people are constantly trying to stop you from doing it. So this is incredibly important for that reason. It's also important because, part of the way that we, are able to engage in our community is by being able to shape it, as Shay said. And so the idea that people lose the right to be able to shape their community simply because of their interaction with a system is unconscionable. So even when I was looking at the main text of this, I was thinking we could have continued striking out that line and allowed people who are incarcerated to be able to vote as well, because it doesn't just have to stop here. Our ability to be able to participate and to shape things should be extended to everyone. But we also know that there really is a health benefit to being able to engage in what we call self-efficacy. And that just means your ability to be able to shape the world around you and to be able to see the things immediately in front of you that can change because of your participation. So there's health benefits to, our civic participation. And that's really one of the big ones. The other reason this is really important is because we live under sort of this ruse that criminal justice is about rehabilitation and reunification. But how is that true if when people are on parole, we don't begin to reintegrate them into society? And how better to do that than to start with something that's so fundamental that requires, our higher level thinking, that requires us to think about, the world and the world we want to live in. It's aspirational in nature. And so this is really important because this right, in my opinion, should never have been taken away. And it's a great way for us to be able to engage people who are coming back after having been part of a system, and be able to engage them fully as human beings.
Thank you. Shay, I want to ask you along the same lines, but kind of switch it just a little bit, because as Flo started to talk about, there's one phrase that kind of kept coming up to me in researching this, and that was the phrase civil death, and just how over the years, this has been something that has grown within our society. And it was something that was very rarely practiced, several hundred years ago, but we've just kind of like, oh, you get a felony, you get a felony. It's like, you can't do this now. So what I want to ask you about in terms of this is, from your experience and what you've continued to fight for now, how do you see this, this change, as we talk about this being civil death, kind of speaking to the change in our collective consciousness?
Well, I think that you have to think about, historically, Black and brown communities have been conditioned to think this was okay, and to think that voting is a privilege. And we have to look at about, when I speak to so many other peoples, because I can't really speak their truth, it's not my space to speak. I'm not disenfranchised right now. I can vote come October 5th. But to have somebody continuously ask, oh, here, register to vote, everybody should vote, sign up here, the feeling that one would have going through all these avenues at community colleges, at work, in all these spaces, what message are we sending, saying you can do all these other things, but this is one thing that you can't do? And I think the doctor said it best, is shaping your community. When someone doesn't feel like they're a part of the voice and the fabric by saying who can represent them, it's sending a message that they are not equal, that they're not whole. And I believe is once someone goes through the process and has paid their debt to society in such a way and have been deemed suitable to come back into the community, we can't slap them in the face by saying, oh, but we're still going to silence you in some areas. Right. I think it's another form of mental health abuse. And I think it's trauma triggering, and it has long stemmed to oppress Black people since Jim Crow. So we know where it starts. We know what its intentions were. And if you're talking about bringing someone whole, just give them their rights to vote. It has nothing to do with their crime.
So on that point, as you started to talk about that, there've been several moves now. If we start from Prop 47, which was in 2014, which is 20 years past, the three strikes law, and how that shifted, a lot of the burden for people from state prisons to county jails, and started to kind of re-usher in getting people re-entering into society. And we've had we've had certain efforts by folks like Senator Holly Mitchell and other folks, including a former boss of mine, Assemblyman Joan Sawyer, to do things like ban the box or work on other kind of reentry issues. I'm going to start with you, Flo. Where does this kind of sit in that box of tools to kind of help someone get back into society? Because you started to kind of touch on it there.
Yeah, it fits really nicely in with all the other things that we're hopefully moving toward. I mean, you mentioned all the ways in which people are disenfranchised, especially by a felony conviction. And those ways really make it so that, to Shay's point, you paid your debt to society, if we even want to call it that. And now you're back out, and there are, over 1,000 licenses that you're not eligible for, right? There are all of these things that just continue to penalize you, and you're trying to make a fresh start. And just imagine everybody, there's a saying like, you're not the worst thing you've ever done in your life, right? And one of the things that really stands out to me as a social justice issue is, in public health, we always talk about nothing about us without us, that we center the voices of the most impacted communities. And so if we're really trying to center the voices of the most impacted communities, how are we going about doing criminal justice reform without people who are formerly or presently incarcerated? Who knows better what's needed than people who are on the ground and who have experienced it themselves, right? That's first and foremost in most things. Like, you would want, people who are parents to be shaping, what childcare looks like. You would want people, who are Black to be shaping what racial justice looks like. You would want people who are undocumented to be shaping, our immigration law. You want people who are impacted to be able to shape these things. And so the idea that we would take the very people who need to be telling us what happens and what comes next and eliminate them is just part of the dehumanization process. And it's just another way that you're reminded that you're not enough, that, we don't care about you, and that we're not here to support you. And a society is strongest when we band together and when we're actually supporting one another and treating each other as our best. And, there's a really, strong saying of, if you treat a person as they are, they'll stay where they are, or maybe even regress. But if you treat people as they could be, they'll become what they should be. And I think that is so powerful in the way of, when you don't talk down to people, when you don't treat them as if, paternalistically, they go so far and above what you might ever imagine. And so it's sort of that continued, imprisonment and, and confinement of who they can be and how they can influence. And I don't want that to be the way that we engage with people in our society, especially when we know that criminal justice is not something where everybody who's been incarcerated, did things very differently than people who aren't.
Yeah.
We certainly know there are plenty of people who have committed crimes and were never arrested or incarcerated for them. And so how dare we then sit on our pedestals and say, well, you don't get to vote because you didn't do it right. And it's like, really? Or did you just not get caught?
True.
That part.
To that point, Shay, I'd like to ask you to really touch on the same thing, please.
I mean, so well said. And it's true. When we think about law, I feel like people know, and it's not us that has to recognize it. Can we just say that? It's not us that has to take a good look at what's been happening. We've been subjected to this treatment for over 401 years. So for us, we have to think about how law is not equally distributed. We have white collar crime and then us. You can pay a fine, you get no probation or parole, you never lose your rights. And then there's us, excessive sentencing, excessive parole sentences. It is very intentional and designed in this way. And so I just feel like right now we're just catching up and righting all the wrongs that we have done to Black and brown communities. This is a no-brainer. And like I said, we have just been subjected to it. So we have to look at them and they've had to take a look on the inside and say, how can we help remove these barriers, these shackles that still disenfranchises Black and brown communities? Prop 17 is just that step. It's to say, hey, we recognize we messed up. That's how it passed and got this far for us to have this conversation. It's a simple change that gives people their rights and makes them feel like they are a part of the fabric of their community.
So on that point, bring up one thing, although I know this is a, kind of a campaign trick, but looking at what Bloomberg did in Florida and paying for all the fines so people could re-enfranchise themselves.
Right.
I'm like, dude, if you got $1 billion, yes, that's how you spend it. That's what
modern day poll
be.
Taxes, by the way. Modern day poll
yes.
taxes.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Exactly in that. And so, and then to that exact point, I'd like for you each to kind of further expand in terms of that point of like poll taxes and things. Well, let me back up for a second. And Shay, I want to go to this question because you've been in this, for a while. And, could you speak to what the current process has been for people who are trying to regain their franchise and, their right to vote?
Yeah. Well, actually, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, well, actually, it's simple. It was written into law since the 1858 to disenfranchise Black people. They were trying to continue to enslave us. And so this was written in law. And California had so many times to ratify and make change. And they said, no, thank you. They continuously did it. And the fabric of all of the laws were specific for us. So when people, like you mentioned earlier, Senator Holly Mitchell, Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, were able to make policy that people that had misdemeanors in jail, in current county jails, they can vote. I advocate, make videos and register them all the time. I advocate to make sure even this election, they get their ballots and that we get to turn them in. But when it comes to people being on parole, they consider that an extension of their prison term when it isn't. It is a supervision to reintegrate, regain your trust in your community, get with your loved ones again. That is the only difference. Everyone else can vote except if you're in prison with a felony conviction and if you're on parole. So it was just written into law. So we're changing that one step. And as Doctor said earlier, let's change it all. We're making it one step ahead. Trust me, we're coming for the rest.
Yeah, because as you point out, in terms of just the point of people being on parole, you can have 3-year paroles, you can have 5-year, you can have 10. You could be like Meek Mill and just kind of like, it's just kind of an ongoing, situation.
Or lifetime.
There.
There's someone that has lifetime parole now that's working with me. Lifetime.
Yeah, so to that point, it's like, how can you, and kind of a statement is like, how can you really expect someone to reintegrate into society if you were never fully trusting them or giving them the tools again?
Yeah.
But
that's the message we're sending.
Yeah. So in that, what I want to ask, start with Flo and then with you, Shay, is just as you may have talked to folks about this ballot measure, what's the perception that people have about Prop 17 when you speak to them? Because I know it's like sometimes you go out and people are like, oh, I understand this is going to raise my taxes. I don't like this. But Prop 17.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't really heard people, obviously COVID means that I'm not engaging with people in the way that I normally would at this time of the year.
True, and you shouldn't be.
And I should not be. So a lot of my engagement has been mostly, online, and or telephone calls and things like that. And I'm not hearing a lot of pushback on the fiscal argument. I don't think people think a lot when they think about, the cost of elections. It's usually campaign finance. It's not usually the cost of literally producing your election and processing ballots and getting people registered to vote. So that's not an argument that I'm hearing at all. What the few people who have asked questions or pushed back have said, well, but what about, and it's mostly this idea of, should we be, and everybody always goes to the absolute most, outrageous example possible, right? And says, well, people who've run afoul of the law, I love that statement, run afoul of the law, why should they be the ones shaping the law, right? They clearly are habitual boundary crossers. So why should we be letting them determine what the boundaries are, right? And my response to that is always, and that's part of the reason why I always use crime in air quotes, because there was a time when it was totally illegal to teach the three of us to read and totally legal to own us. And so if we want to talk about who's committing crimes, us reading our ballot book would have been a punishable offense, and somebody literally owning us would not have been. So crime is certainly socially constructed, and I'm not saying that, there aren't things that people can do to harm one another. But I do think this idea that, suddenly people don't deserve to be able to participate because of crimes socially defined is really challenging for me. And I think, part of what I'm seeing in terms of pushback from people is this old school idea of, law and order, good people and bad people. And so therefore we want to do everything we can to punish the bad people. And so part of my pushback has been, how's that working out for us? Right. In the same way that I think to myself, so we incarcerate the most people on the planet. Do you feel safe? And I mean that sort of in the Bane kind of voice, how safe do you feel though? Right. Because I don't think people would describe us as feeling particularly safe, but we're doing all of these things in the service of our safety. So, part of what it's been helpful to talk to people about is the health benefit, the benefit to again, recidivism, and the way in which integrating people into society is really helpful. It's also beneficial to talk about, the success stories, right? Because everybody always talks about who ended up going back to prison, who created a safety risk. You always hear the exceptions to the rule, and you don't hear about the many people who are out and who are doing amazing things with their lives, right? Shay is walking around every day and people aren't going, oh, she's one of the, right? They're using her as an example of what you should be when you grow up, kids, right? With ignoring part of her history and her background. So I think that's been a really successful. I've convinced most of the people who were, none of them were strong no's. They were just kind of on the fence, but they also didn't have a deep understanding of some of the social issues. And I think when we have these conversations with people and kind of explain it, there's a light bulb that goes off.
Shay, same question.
So I've been doing a lot of work when it comes to having interviews with press, endorsements for support for Prop 17. And the only opposition that I've had was from the Election Integrity Project of California. And they were at the very beginning, coming to the meetings. They don't come anymore. and I think that I was able to just say is that many people don't look at me in this light. When they see me, they would have never known my past unless I told them. Right. But I felt comfortable enough to be oh, they think that we're this. Well, let me shed some light about who Shay Franco Clausen is and where she comes from and what I had to overcome, but it's still a part of me. And it was in those meetings where the only thing they said is, what about the victims? The victims don't want them to have their rights to vote. I've never had anyone challenge me except the Election Integrity Project. That's it. And in that, I was able to just give a little insight to what Black women experience here in America, what we've had to go through in the barriers. Not only did I survive sex trafficking and the juvenile hall system, I had to then regain myself with no guidance, no support, no direction I had to get the cow, get the leather, make my boots, then put my boots on. And I had to explain them through having all those different barriers. Yeah. So, and here I am today, an elected official, serving on so many capacities, mentoring, working in the jails to try to help other people know that they can be right here having this interview with people like you. And that's the challenge I give to them, saying, no, we can, once we get options and opportunities that has been intentionally kept away from us, we can do so many other things. I've never made a crime against anyone ever again. And I'm very proud of that. And so I just say, there's not a lot of opposition. But in that is so many people make mistakes. Do we hold them to that one bad choice they made?
So thank you for that. And so it brings me to another question. And, and you both have kind of touched on part of this is, and kind of speaking to anti-recidivism efforts and overall. So two things as I kind of get to this. One, if you could talk to anti-recidivism efforts, where this kind of falls in, and just kind of general. So what is recidivism as well? So people kind of understand that, because it doesn't necessarily sound like an English term, but in doing so, I just want to kind of further put this framework on it, is that when, further, researching, when you look at the LAO's report again, that it was saying for the state of California, from the years 2018, 2019, it was costing us an average of $81,000 to keep someone in jail. So with that kind of framework, if Flo, you could start, and then Shay, if you could then jump in, kind of speak to, what is recidivism in a general term, and then why anti-recidivism efforts are important.
Sure. So just defining recidivism as, people who end up incarcerated again after having already been incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges is, the more that we penalize people when they come out. And I have both in my personal life, in my own family, my own brother was incarcerated for a good deal of his adult life. And there is, as well as close friends and other folks, and there is this real hope that people have about coming out and wanting to turn their lives around. And the more that we don't allow people to have a fresh start and to be able to set goals and to be able to achieve them, the more frustrating it becomes, right? And so over time, when we think about recidivism, it's often, people sort of backsliding into social networks they were in before, backsliding into crimes of necessity sometimes because they're unable to provide for themselves. If you make it impossible to get public housing, if you make it difficult to be able to, get student loans, if you make it difficult for people to be able to get licenses and be able to get trained and to do all these things to be able to support themselves, you're left with nothing but the underground economy unless you happen to be one of the privileged people who come from a wealthy family. And if you are, you're really unlikely to have been incarcerated in the first place. So the whole idea is that when we continue to punish people in these ways, then it really kind of boxes them into having to rely on things outside of what we consider to be sort of the legal economy in order to be able to make money, support themselves, et cetera. And so the more that we can integrate people back into society, the more that we can capitalize on that fresh start, the more successful people are when they come back out. And so it really is a way of sort of, punishing people over and over again is often what leads to recidivism. And not providing them with the support to reintegrate, right? Like, if you've been in prison for 30 years and you come back out, the internet wasn't a thing when you went in. And so now getting jobs and doing all this stuff, you're going to need some support. You're going to need a social navigator to kind of walk you through, like, this is how we live life now, right? And we're not particularly supportive in a really robust way of doing that necessary work. And so that's why things like this are so important.
Shay, same thing.
I echo +1 everything that the good doctor has said. It's all facts. And so I think that is really what motivated me. It was like the impetus to my advocacy, working in my local jails to build those partnerships with our local GED programs, our junior colleges, and our universities, as well as the unions, to make sure that we're also working with them on the inside and giving them the housing, the support system they're going to need on the outside. That's truly how you reduce recidivism, is if you're saying, like, yes, if this time that you've given somebody says that it's going to pay their debt, you're going to rehabilitate them. Well, if you're not giving them the tools and the necessities to be successful, then why are you incarcerating them? Why are you even locking them up? I think we need alternative plans to prison and alternative plans to, jails. If we want to talk about the realness of, mental health and generational trauma that Black people specifically have endured for, hundreds of years. And as soon as right now, we're sort of acknowledging it, right? We're starting to see people bring things, I know, tiny bit, but that's how they were able to disable us, to separate us. And when you don't have that connection, especially, can you imagine since March, nobody's had a visitor, not from their wife, their kids, not their loved one, to prevent COVID, but all sorts of COVID broke out in the prisons. Things are designed and they're intentional. So now you have people have been in there for 8 months with no connection, no programming. What does that say to them then? When they're gonna have 8 months of missing of opportunities to be able to work with the programs. There's so many great programs out there and organizations that are really working in the prison to try to give them those tools that they need. 30 years someone was locked up. How are they gonna know how to navigate this MacBook? So we have to think about creating more robust programs and coming up with an alternative to prison. Because I guarantee you, when Reagan cut down all the mental health facilities back in the 80s, was it the 80s or early 70s? We didn't have a place
70s,
for people 70s. Yeah. Well, they didn't have a place for people with mental health. And that's the majority of our brothers and sisters from the trauma they've had to deal with on the streets because of lack of services. So if we don't start recognizing that as in our counties and in our states, that we should have supportive housing, supportive programs, not 9 months. You've been in there 30 years. What's 9 months going to do for you? You need to have long-term housing with long-term programs that are going to give you into a position to sustain yourself, as well as having your right to vote.
So I know we digressed a little bit, but I want to kind of keep on that track, because as we've been going through this conversation, it's, particularly in terms of reintegration and getting someone back fully in society and giving them, stake in society. I wanted you to, to kind of talk a little bit more about that. And the two things that really kind of came up to me is, one, in a former job, I worked with a colleague who was able to put together a program within state prisons where they would take inmates who were, close to release, start, training them in jobs, and then make sure that they were then trained on how to take the state exam and fill out, which is a complicated process in itself, but made sure that when they were released, they had a job that was going to give them family supporting wages and health care. And then secondly, to a point that you had made earlier, Flo, in terms of like some of the other barriers, remind me that there's a program that in Indianapolis, of all places, started, where people upon release, they're like, no, we just don't want to train you for a job. The Chamber of Commerce was actively removing barriers so people could get licenses. Because they recognize the whole dichotomy of, it's like, well, who's going to hire this person if we're not dealing with some of the liability issues and, retraining this person? Well, wait a minute. Why don't we get them a license? Why don't we make them a business owner? And it's just one of those things to me. It's like that now this person has a license, has a business, is probably, has a shop. Now they're more invested and they're going to be looking up and down the ballot and, and everything else. So as we kind of digress for a moment from Prop 17, Shay, you really started to talk about some of the other programs that were out there and that were necessary for reintegration, because what I want to kind of get to in this is I don't want people to think, I want them to understand how important this is as part of the overall ballot, but two is get them to understand that there are multiple, steps, to, in terms of what we need to do. So Shay, if you could take another few moments and just kind of talk a little bit more about some of those programs that are out there that are good, that are helping to reintegrate folks.
Well, I'll tell you this, that we're in the coalition for Prop 17. It was ACA 6, then it was Prop 17. Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Initiate Justice, and LSPC, Cut 50. I mean, there was so many other programs. As I was coming in, I learned so much, and getting to know the Black men leading this charge. Taking 25 years. One said he was in solitary confinement for 9 of that. To coming out, this man Ken is amazing. And even him, he's taken his lived experience and starting that in a program that I'm willing to help. To have access is, I used to work for the state of California, and when I worked for state assembly, many people with criminal histories would call and say, well, because of my past conviction, my felony, I can't apply for this license for me to continue my growth. Shay, what you gonna do about it? And I was like, we need to change this. We have to talk about not just the practices, changing the laws that enables them. That's another barrier. They don't find out until they're right there. What are we telling them? So I think the programs that are inside that are currently in the jails are successful, but we need more robust programs, which is starting to come up. That is that handoff. You got 9 months, 6 months left. We should be finding out where you're going to be paroled at, if it's parole. Where's your probation officer? We need to meet that person and let them know you got support, that you're not leaving alone. You got a posse of people that are going to help you, but the program should start in the jails. I think that's, while there's still this entity, if we're spending $80,000 a year, you said, right, on one person being, then they should have every program known to man to get them ready for this. So that means the funding is there, because $80,000 a year means the funding is there. Right?
Mhm.
That's what it says to me. So programs like CROP, ARC, what they're doing now to make sure that there's pathways for success is what we really should be investing in. And I applaud those men for stepping up to help other men get out of the prison. I know us women, we're trying to get other women in who are normally the custodial parent, don't have the visits that men get. If you ever notice, there's a complete difference. Women are usually bringing their children and family to the prisons to see their dads, their uncles, their brothers. But on the other side, it's very hard for women to, reunite with their families. So there's just so many ways that we can help stabilize them and get them prepared to be successful. We need to take that same funding and invest in local and county and state organizations that are really trying to make that transition to reduce recidivism.
Khaim, can I add on to that?
Please.
Because I think there's a soapbox that I really just want to get on really quickly.
Yeah.
So this year, California finally made the decision that we want to make sure that the people who have been keeping us safe from these wildfires for years are able to be hired as firefighters after they get out. They're being paid slave wages, like while they are in prison and are fighting fires, putting their lives on the line, and then they get out of prison and we say to them, sorry, you're not eligible to do the thing you've been doing on behalf of the state for slave wages now that you're outside. It was ridiculous. And so I'm happy it happened. I'm also annoyed, and this is my probably annoyance at the perils of capitalism, that what it took was a pandemic where the state was on fire in such an unsustainable way that we had to do it because we were so short-staffed and there was like a critical need for additional labor. It shouldn't have taken all of that, right? We shouldn't have had to get to that place. But another example of the ways in which we just don't get things right, and we talked earlier about sort of the change in definition of crime. So 4 years ago, it was still illegal to sell marijuana. Now it's legal. And we certainly have the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development has their grants out to be able to support people who were harmed by the war on drugs. Great. But what we didn't do and bake into, Prop 64 was first priority to the people who were running marijuana businesses and were harmed by the incarceration to get first dibs on the licenses to get backing and support to establish their businesses. So now these equity programs are coming up and running and people are getting involved, but it's 4 years later and the people who were, crime, these people need to be thrown away, have been able to walk away with millions of dollars because they are saturating the market with their dispensaries and with their oils and with their delivery systems. All this stuff. And it's just another example of how people are incarcerated and harmed for so long. And then what we do to be able to support them, even when we're trying to get it right with marijuana, is just a pittance. And by the time you get in, the market is saturated. I'm not inventing Coke now. Coke exists, right? Like Coca-Cola been around for a generation. There's no getting into the soda market in a real way to be able to dominate at this point, right? But if they had been given first priority, even if it meant a little lag before we had more dispensaries up and running, they could have been able to dominate the market, and that could have been some real restorative justice. So I just want to put that out in people's minds that all you folks out here keeping the state of California afloat during this pandemic with your going to these dispensaries and, and contributing to the state coffers, I just want you to know that you really need to think about how that was a crime not that long ago, and all the people who were harmed by it who now still aren't able to get into those businesses. And that's just one of the ways that we need to have conversations about this stuff and really doing right by people.
And why didn't they have first dibs?
Primacy.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like, why didn't they have first dibs?
Primacy and grandfather clauses will be the death of equity in this country.
That's right.
We always want to let people hold on to the privilege they already have, and we never want to give them the ability to get a competitive edge. That's because we know how important it is, because we know it's a game changer, and so we just simply won't do it.
Well, and it's like we're just, in many institutions, people are not educated enough, and I say this of the various elected officials and policymakers are in now, they're not educated enough to look through things through a different lens that's not their own. when they have their council of people that surround them, they're not including enough diverse voices so that there's someone in the back saying, hey, you know what, shouldn't do that. It's like you need to change that, but yeah, a crime is not a crime, and we're constantly changing, and it shows how, as we as a society are continuing to evolve. But I think to this, in terms of Prop 17, it's like, yes, it's a start. We get people reinvested, but it is also a continuous change. And I think, and Shay, you can kind of, speak more. I'd like you to speak more to this, because it's like there's an old analogy for war in terms of like, it's always a battle for hearts and minds. And so just because we are changing this, what are some of the other things that you see that we have to kind of continue to do? Because otherwise then it's like, all right, so we change this, people can, vote on parole. We're done, right? No. So what is it that you've seen that, is kind of like the next step, something that has to continue on in this?
So if we're specifically talking about voter registration and eligibility, I think that this is just one step. And I think the doctor said it. I was right in. I tooted that then we should have, like other states that never take people's voting rights away. They can vote right in the prison. I think passing this then comes with a great responsibility. Like, I don't want to be the face of this proposition and not do the work. So I'm committed to implementing this, making sure that everyone on parole, I'll work with every reentry center, knows that they have the right to vote. Like, come on now, Snoop Dogg didn't even know he had the right to vote. This is his first election. Snoop Dogg, who has access to so much money and so many knowledgeable
and Martha
people.
Stewart.
Don't get me started. I'm not ready to go there. But I'm saying, like, we have to recognize that these systems were intentional. And then until we take down the people who make the decision and replace them with more progressive people of color that reflect the communities, those barriers that the doctor mentioned, even when it comes to dispensaries, will still exist. And so, I'm sorry.
So what you're kind of talking about then is like
this is one step.
Civics and better civic education. It's like there are several folks that I can point to now who are doing a good job and trying to expand that, but they're hampered simply because they're just kind of like one entity or one institution. So yes, I mean, and particularly from my experience, you speaking to the fact of implementation, because
you gotta implement it.
A lot of folks in my career would go through, I passed the bill, got signed, I'm done. And I would essentially equate that to, it's like, if you ever see those like, late night clips on ESPN of the guy who runs 99 yards and then drops the ball right before he gets in the end zone.
Yes.
That's what this
exactly
is. Because because once you get the implementation,
I think you'll appreciate, Khaim. It's like saying, my kid's 18, so I'm done.
Yes.
Right?
Dude, come on.
Since I talked to my mom for 2 hours last night. Since when is 18 the end of parenting?
Like, my job
it doesn't end. And I can tell you, it's like they're still heavily in my refrigerator. So it's like.
But no, it's implementation. You can't pass things without doing the work. And so I'm just committed. And for me, it is about, I never tell people to vote because people died for it. I move away from that. I say, vote because you only understand what happened to you is when that law is being put upon you. You're like, how did this happen? And I was like, brother, man, that was on the ballot like 4 years ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think we have to do a better job. And while I can't reach the 2.7% in Santa Clara County, all of them that are Black, I try every day to make sure I connect with people and educate people, because 17% of the people that I've talked to over the last 6 months about Prop 17, they had misdemeanors and never voted. They had criminal histories from 20 years ago and never voted because they even thought they didn't have the right.
Right.
So I don't put it on anybody else. It's my responsibility, at least in my community, is to educate them and give them the tools and train the trainer, give them the book to run and train others. We shouldn't have this scarcity issue of trying to hold power. We should be giving it out to everybody so we can have a very well-educated, proactive community of people of color advocating for our rights all the time.
Thank you. So we are coming up on about 10 minutes to the hour. So at this point, I want to give you guys both an opportunity to make some closing remarks. And if there's something that you didn't kind of hit on that you want to bring up, and also, particularly for some of the other efforts that you're involved in, or for the efforts specifically that you're involved in, Shay, to kind of give folks a little more information or ways in which they can find some information. So Flo, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So to Shay's point, I always think it's really important to emphasize how the ballot directly impacts you. And so I was actually having a conversation with some of the advanced peace fellows in Sacramento. And I was saying, how many of y'all think the cost of rent is way too high? And all their hands went up, right? And I was like, guess what's on your ballot? Not just who's going to be president, but there are two measures if you live in Sacramento, a local one and the state one, that are talking about why the rent is too high and what we can do about it. And so I think that's always a much more compelling argument, is the ways in which, especially, you can engage in direct action really in terms of being able to make decisions. And then I actually sat them and I was like, so do you know how by what margin this particular thing passed? Do you know how many votes were cast? How many Twitter followers do you have? Oh, you have 4,000 Twitter followers? This won by 400 votes, right? So I think
to that, you can even give the example now of all the kids, on TikTok and everything, who shut down Trump's, rally by going in. It's like, we're just going to scoop up those tickets. Yes.
You have power. And so in that spirit, I'm part of two groups, the Sacramento Sister Circle, as well as Black Women Organized for Political Action. And so we have, since 2014, I believe it is, put out for every single election a voter guide. It's written in, AAVE Welcome, which is African American Vernacular English. We are snarky. We use pop culture references. We explain, we get exasperated, we share all of the emotions that you may have going through your ballot, but we start at the top of that ballot and work our way down to the bottom and give our recommendations for what we think is in the interest of equity, what we think is in the interest of Black women in particular, but also being good allies and abolitionists and co-conspirators with other communities. We really try to make sure that we are putting it out. You don't have to agree with everything that's in there. There will always be things that are controversial, but we put it out as an act of love to our community. And so it will be available on October 3rd. And I think the link is at the bottom, sacramentosistercircle.com/vote. And so really encourage you to share it. Big shout out to State Senator Holly Mitchell, who always hits us up and says, hey, where's the voter guide? Because the bottom stuff about Sacramento doesn't apply, but the top part of the ballot is really helpful. And I'm going to pass it around to folks. And I just want to, if you happen to be a person who caught this, who doesn't live in California, or who lives in another community, Sacramento doesn't have to be the only one with a voter guide. It literally started with a Google Doc and some folks chatting about, well, what you got on Prop 55? What you got on 56? And doing some research together. So it's a labor of love, and you're probably doing it anyway. So consider making one for your community as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
And Shay?
So, Flo, I am also Silicon Valley WAPA, and so and it's very important. And I actually use their voter guide. I give it out to people because it is snarky, it is fun, it is engaging, and it speaks to sisters, and it speaks to our community in a way that is inclusive. So I have to say that I passed that one out too. Thank you for doing that work. As well as I use Courage California, another sister mom. I'm gonna shout you out. And League of Women Voters, I always do, and I do a complete guide too to my friends and family, but I don't believe in, reinventing the work. I take what they got in Sacramento, what Courage, and I pull it together and say what pertains to my county, because Flo's right, doesn't matter. The initiatives on the ballot, everyone's going to vote on those, but in your counties, in your cities, in your districts, our ballots look differently. And so what I do is I host this Beats Ballots and Bubbles, or when we were in real life, I used to have a club and everybody would come bring their ballots. And all I do is give them information, places for them to complete their ballots. So this year, I'm actually doing it at Venice Beach on October 10th. And it's called a vote test, because everybody wants to get to the street and protest, but why not protest and vote? So we're making this, we have this conversation truck that's got a DJ booth and a space for my podcast. And we're going to be filming people, giving them information from different propositions, and the ROV out there is working with us so people can come together. And you can protest wherever you are, as long as your protest comes with some meaning. You better vote. Yeah. So we're going to walk them through the ballot. We're going to use the Sacramento voter guide, if you don't mind if I highlight that. But
please.
But it's about the movement. You got to meet people where they are. You got to take them to the streets. You got to give them food and drinks, whatever it is, because right now this election is critical, and it's going to impact the lives of millions. And we're responsible. We are responsible for those 55,627 people that are relying on us to vote yes on Prop 17. So next year they can join in any election. Yep. So I say, if you want to find out more, Sugar Shay on Instagram, SHUGGASHAY. But for more information about Prop 17, it is yeson17.vote. Please, we have information about getting involved, getting engaged. We need support. Show up. It's time to vote, y'all.
And one more thing, I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Voices River City podcast. We went through all of the state propositions in episode 91. That's Voices River City podcast. And then lastly, when we talk about get out the vote, and a lot of people will talk about phone banking and things like that. And I know some of us are kind of shy, or maybe don't want to talk to people, who don't want to call people because we know how annoying it is when telemarketers call us, or, people harassing us. One of the things that I love doing is just picking up the phone and calling the people I know and talking to them about, so that's my phone banking. It gives me two things. I get to connect with my friends who maybe I haven't talked to in a little while. And also I'm getting out the vote. We're talking through the propositions. We're talking through what's on the ballot, and we're just catching up. So, you don't have to make this complicated. Call the people tell them about the propositions about, ask them about the ones you're curious about. Let's make this a community thing. We're all physically distancing, but we're trying to be socially close. So let's re-engage those ties that bind, and let's talk to each other about what's happening.
And I would also, just kind of add to that as we, wrap up, since we're all very politically active folks, now is kind of our time, because we've been trumpeting these messages for years, if not decades. And now people are like, well, hey, I understand that there's something important. Excellent. Come in. Welcome to the party. No, you're not too late. We can, there's space for you. So with that, I would like to bring in one other member of the and founder of the Sac Change Coalition, Brianna Mullen, to help close us out. And I would like to thank you, Flo, and thank you, Shay, very much for your time this evening and your efforts in helping people to understand what Proposition 17 is. So with that, Brianna.
Hi, Khaim. Thank you so much. I just want to thank Flo and Shay again for your time and your passion fighting for this. We so appreciate you coming to talk about how important it is to vote yes for Prop 17. But the most important part of that statement is to vote. And so I'm here to make sure that you understand how to do that. First of all, if you're registered in the state of California, you're going to receive a ballot at your home, at your registration address. And so you can check that by going on voterstatus.sos.ca.gov to make sure that you know where your ballot is going to be sent. Every person this year will receive a vote by mail ballot. And so you can take it at your home through all of the ballots. You can bring your ballot to our next event next Thursday, where we're talking about Proposition 20, and you can start filling it out with us. But if you don't receive a ballot home for any reason, or if you lose your ballot, you can always do a conditional voter registration or same-day registration and submit a provisional ballot at any voter center. So you can look up where your nearest voter center is. You can literally Google, where is my vote center? There's quite a few helpful links that will help you find your nearest center, and you can always walk into any voter center and do a conditional voter registration. If for some reason your name isn't on the list, they have to let you vote, right? So Flo and Shay talked about the important history of disenfranchisement and poll taxes. And so it's really important that you know, in California, under the California Voting Rights Act, that you can vote at any location with a conditional voter registration. And so your provisional ballot can be cast at that location, and then they'll take it and they'll submit it later on. So remember that you can submit your ballot. You can put it in the mail. It's going to be pre-posted this year. You don't have to find a stamp. You don't have to go to Walgreens and try and find 45 cents to buy a stamp. You can literally just put it in your mailbox. You can also drop it off at any of the ballot drop boxes, or you can hand it in person at a voting center. You can return it to your ballot in your polling place. There's going to be 10 days before the election throughout California and in Sacramento County where you can drop off ballots. And You have to have it in by 8 p.m. on November 3rd. So make
And I
sure.
think that's really important what you're saying there, because there are a lot of folks I know who are like, well, I have my absentee ballot, but I don't trust the mail because I've seen all these things going on. So the point that you really hit there is like, hey, look, if you're at all concerned, fill it out and you can go drop it off.
Exactly. And if you want to track your ballot, you can actually track your ballot via text message, email, or voice call. You go to where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov. You make sure that your vote gets counted and that, you know, you're turning it in as early as possible, right? But not until after you make sure that you come to our next events and learn about Prop 20 and Prop 25. You know, one important thing that's just a reminder is that if you're doing a vote by mail return, you're gonna have a pink envelope and you're gonna be asked to sign that, right? Somebody else can drop it off for you, right? If you're high risk and you don't want to be going outside, or for me, I'm gonna be taking my grandmother's ballot to the ballot box. Make sure that they sign on that envelope, and you're gonna want to make sure that it's as close as possible to your driver's license. So, you know, we always hear about horror stories of people's ballots kind of being thrown out if the signature doesn't match, and that's thing that, you know, the Secretary of State's office wants to make sure happen. But, you know, the Secretary of State's office has also said that county elections will process all ballots that are postmarked by Election Day. So even if you put it in the mail on Election Day, if it's postmarked that day, it will be counted. But, you know, it's best to just make sure that you're getting it in as early as possible, and make sure to have a plan to vote. You know, like Flo said, call up your friends, call up your family, make sure they have a plan to vote, whether or not you're going to have one person bring it in or you're going to go as a group. You know, just stay safe and make sure that you bring a mask if you're going to be at a polling center.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for making sure that, you know, people understand that they've got to have a plan to vote. They need to remember when it is, and they need to make sure that they have the information they need to get their ballot in. So with that, I'd like to thank you, the rest of the members of the Sac Change Coalition, and our guests, Shay and Flo, for joining us for this discussion on Prop 17. And thank you to all of you who've tuned in to this, and hopefully you tune in again for future town halls. Thank you.